All right, so here we are, chapter 7. Let me just go ahead and say this from the beginning. Chapter 7 is probably one of the most important chapters that we will be looking at throughout the year. There's so much foundational information politically that takes place here. With the start of the new nation, we finished the ratification of the Constitution, and now we have the early presidencies of George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. So when you put all of that together, there is so much foundation politically, internationally, and economically that will carry us through many, many other time periods. So chapter 7, very important. Let's go ahead and get started. And coming out of the Revolutionary War, there were, and the Articles of Confederation, right? We knew that there were some significant problems, especially with finances, the national debt. Very few countries around the world gave any chance for the United States to survive. There were also restrictions on US trade around the world. If we were trying to sell goods to any of the English territories or colonies in the Caribbean, those colonies were still subject to the Navigation Acts, which meant that they could only import directly from England. So that meant that we had to sell to England, that turned around and sold to those colonies in the Caribbean. And still, the British soldiers have not evacuated the West. So that's definitely a problem that is still ongoing, even after many, many years after the Treaty of Paris, 1783, that was supposed to be the end of British occupation. George Washington, unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. He's the only one to win unanimously in the Electoral College. There have been some who've come close, but no one has won unanimously like George Washington did. And that's because he was so well respected and popular across many, many different demographic groups, whether you were from the North or the South, whether you were from financially the upper class or the lower class. People were supportive of George Washington because of his service to the nation. And if we think back, that really began 1754 when he goes out for Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia, goes out to that Ohio territory, ends up sparking the French and Indian War. But that was over 30 years prior to him becoming president of the United States. So he has pretty much his whole adult life is in service to his country. And he will serve as president. He also has, so he would have been part of that Federalist faction that had supported ratification of the Constitution. In addition, the House of Representatives and the Senate, in their first session of the legislature, was also primarily made up of Federalists, as you would expect. But nobody had ever been president before. This was brand new. There wasn't a whole lot of understanding of exactly what the role would entail. George Washington kind of carves that out while he's president. And we call that setting a precedent. A precedent here, this is not president like the office. A precedent would be an example that others later on will follow. And George Washington is going to do that in a number of cases. One in particular that seems kind of trivial, but nobody knew how to address the president. What do you call the president? And people like John Adams were wanting some really lofty, regal sounding title for the president. It was something, Adams wanted it to be called something like Your Excellency, the Most High Grand, something. And George Washington said, no, I think Mr. President will be fine. So he kind of establishes that as the tradition, and we still use that title to refer to the President of the United States. He also, in another example of a precedent that he sets, is he establishes a cabinet of advisors. Washington was savvy enough to recognize that he didn't have expertise in all of the areas that would be necessary for him to govern the United States. And he surrounded himself with people who did have expertise in different areas. And this becomes known as the cabinet. So these are the heads of each of the executive branch departments. The Department of State is going to be dealing with foreign affairs. How does the United States interact with other nations? And as the Secretary of State, which would be the head of that department, Thomas Jefferson was chosen by George Washington. And that was an excellent choice. Thomas Jefferson had been a diplomat representing the United States during the early years of the Articles of Confederation over in France. He spoke like 5 or 6 languages fluently. He was very familiar with the leaders, the European leaders that George Washington would have never met before. So that was a pretty wise choice for an advisor to help guide George Washington in foreign affairs issues. Henry Knox, you'll remember that he was the bookseller who had wanted a career in politics and ended up bringing the cannon back from Fort Ticonderoga, which nobody thought was possible. And George Washington promoted him to be over all of the supply chain during the American Revolution. So he also will be tagged as the Secretary of War. So he will, during peacetime, still maintain and organize efforts to be prepared in case war comes to the United States. Then there's Alexander Hamilton, and I know that he's very, very popular currently with the musical that's come out. And Hamilton is going to be chosen by George Washington to be his Secretary of the Treasury. And Hamilton, as you may know, has a very interesting background. He was born on one of the Caribbean islands. His parents, his father may or may not have been a certain individual who really was not part of his life. His mother had a questionable background as well, and she died when he was a young boy. So Hamilton is more or less an orphan on this island, but he's really, really smart. And because he was so smart and he was in a desperate situation, it was starting to lead him down a bad path where he was getting into trouble trying to survive, basically. So some of the adults on the island recognized the brilliance of Alexander Hamilton and knew that they needed to try to help him channel all of this brilliance into a more productive path. And they get him to the United States so that he can enroll in college. He was like, I don't know, 15, 16 years old when he enrolls in college. And then the Revolutionary War breaks out and he volunteers to serve. His paths will cross with George Washington, who's significantly older, but Washington recognizes again this brilliance, this really savvy, clever, resourceful individual, and promotes him because, similar to Henry Knox, he's like, that's the kind of person that I want helping to lead this military effort. So Alexander Hamilton really becomes George Washington's right-hand man. He works very, very closely with George Washington. And so now he's been put in charge of the Treasury Department, which is probably one of the most important positions in this new government, given the financial crisis that the country was facing. So Hamilton is going to come in, and he actually in some ways makes the others jealous in some situations because Hamilton and Washington have a special relationship. And that goes back to the fact that Hamilton really didn't have a father. Washington never had children of his own. So they kind of fill this void for one another. And it becomes a bond that Jefferson in particular becomes quite frustrated with because he views it as Washington always siding with Hamilton when there are disagreements within the cabinet. And then you have Edmund Randolph, who is going to be the Attorney General, which is the job of the Attorney General is to represent the United States in court cases. So this is really a great group of very, very knowledgeable individuals who have been given these responsibilities within Washington's cabinet. So now that we have the new government in place, we've had the elections, we've got the first Congress that is now in session. They need to fulfill some of those obligations that were committed to during the ratification debate. And one of those will be a Bill of Rights that we'll talk about in just a second. But then the other one is part of the Constitution. And you'll remember from when you did the Constitution packet, it talked about that the court system would be set up as a Supreme Court and then lower federal courts as set up by the legislature. So that's what they do. 1789 is the first session of the new legislature. They're going to create 13 new federal courts, one for each of the states, to supplement the Supreme Court. So this is going to be the place where most of those federal cases will be heard. Then if there are appeals, right, if the verdict somehow is challenged, then it would go to one of the 3 circuit courts of appeals. So they divide up the 13 territories into circuits. So any case in these 3 states that is challenged from the district court would go to the Circuit Court of Appeals. And then the same thing with these states and the same things with the New England states. And then if it's appealed from the Circuit Court, then it goes to the Supreme Court. One of the other provisions of the Judiciary Act of 1789 that was established, which will become important in our story in a few minutes, is the one of the powers that they grant to the Supreme Court. And it's one of issuing what's called a writ of mandamus. Writ, W-R-I-T, of mandamus, M-A-N-D-A-M-U-S. So a writ of mandamus is almost like a mandate or an order for someone to carry out some sort of an action. So it was granting the Supreme Court the power to issue writs of mandamus to other members of the government to get them to do to fulfill some sort of an action, right? So it's almost like a legal requirement or mandate that something be carried out. So keep that in mind as we move forward, because that will play a role in our story here in a few minutes. They do add a Bill of Rights. You'll remember that that was one of the agreements between the two factions in the ratification debate. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were at odds over whether or not the Constitution protected individual rights. And the Anti-Federalists said, we're not going to sign this, we're not going to adopt this unless individuals are protected from abuse of the government. And the Federalists said, okay, if you just ratify in the way that it's written now, the first thing that we'll do in the new government is create a Bill of Rights or amendments that will be added to the original Constitution that do protect those individual rights. And they fulfill that obligation, because remember, most of the House and the Senate at the time is made up of Federalists, but they do honor that promise that had been created. And so we have the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are all passed together in 1791. So they introduce it in that first legislature of 1789. They negotiate all of them, 1790, and then it goes out to the states to be ratified, because again, a change to the Constitution has to be ratified by the states and the people. So these are the 10 amendments. The first one you're probably familiar with, that protects individual rights of speech and press, petition, assembly, and religion. Then we've got the second one dealing with militia and the right to bear arms. Then we have a whole group of amendments that are talking about rights of accused people. People who are accused of a crime have certain rights that the government can't violate. And then we get down here to the very last one. Amendment number 10 says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So they're saying if it's not granted in the Constitution, then it's a power reserved for the states. Also keep that in mind, because that's going to play a key role also in just a few minutes. So here's some pictures. The first government of the United States. Washington, D.C. didn't exist at that time. And George Washington took the first oath of office here in New York City at what became known as Federal Hall. And it's right here on Wall Street. The New York Stock Exchange is right across the street from this. You've got this large statue to George Washington where he took the oath of office. So during his presidency, part of the time the government will be operating in New York. Part of the time it will be operating in Philadelphia before they decide on a permanent location for the capital of the United States. So here again at the base of the statue, showing where George Washington became the first president of the United States. So here are the things that Washington's got to deal with. The financial crisis is really, really bad. That's probably the key issue that must be addressed. The debt from the Revolutionary War has not been paid back. You've got creditors who had loaned resources, loaned cash to the Continental Congress to conduct this war. They've not been paid back, and they're really putting pressure to get those payments. Now, the federal government owes money, but also the states owe money. Each state had its own militia. Each state is also going to have to pay those creditors back. And the financial situation is desperate at this time. Trade, again, very limited from the navigation acts that are being implemented by Great Britain. And this is the priority, and it falls to Alexander Hamilton to sort this out. So Hamilton very quickly starts to really promote his ideas in the legislature. And he issues a number of reports. These are the three main reports that Hamilton writes to the legislature, trying to explain what he thinks needs to be done about the financial problems. The report on public credit. Credit is how you are paying back your debts. He has a plan for how he thinks this needs to be carried out. He has a report on the national bank. He decides that one way to resolve part of this problem is to have a Bank of the United States, a national bank that's going to unify the currency for all the states, that's going to bring in revenue, that's going to make payments on the debt that is owed. And this is kind of a controversial approach that Hamilton is going to suggest in his report on the national bank. And then the last one is the report on manufacturers. Hamilton also is saying we need to really diversify. We are currently a country based on agriculture, right? It is all about agriculture making the profit here in the United States. And he's saying we need to supplement that with manufacturing and industry, not totally get away from agriculture, but add to. If you've got agricultural provisions here or focus in this region, then we need to have manufacturing within the United States as well to be able to make money. So you may remember from the Hamilton musical, one of the songs it's talking about writing like you're running out of time. And that was really talking about his role in writing the Federalist Papers, because he wrote the bulk of the 85 Federalist Papers. He's also going to be just exhaustive in his efforts to try to explain his promotion here of the bank and manufacturing and acquiring public debt. So these reports are the first suggestion of his plan. People start to get a little concerned. So here's what he decides to do. He's going to figure out a way to make debt actually a good thing. He's going to say, if you have debt and you demonstrate that you can pay it back, then the next time you need to borrow money, people are going to be more likely to provide it to you. So he views the debt really as a good thing as long as you're making payments. He's not really planning to pay it down to zero, but he is looking to fund the debt, as we'll see, meaning make payments along the way to satisfy your creditors. He's going to sell bonds, which are really investments in the United States government. A bond is where you would give your cash to the government and they're going to issue you a slip of paper. And that slip of paper has the value that you've provided, but it also entitles you to interest over the course of the bond's life. And then at the end, you cash the bond in, you get your cash back plus some interest. But in the meantime, the federal government has cash to work with on hand, because right now they don't have any cash. He's also going to come up with some pretty clever ways of raising revenue. He's going to do that through taxation and a tariff, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then he's also going to establish this Bank of the United States, which will be in charge of promoting the currency throughout the United States, and then also making loans for people who want to start new businesses, which he would hope would be in the manufacturing arena. So those are his plans. And this assumption of the debt is interesting. So when we say assumption of the debt, we're talking about acquiring the state debt. So if you look at this diagram, the money that the federal government owed as of 1790 to various creditors, whether it's foreign investors, whether it's people within the United States who had contributed to the war cause, that totaled $54 million. Now, in today's money, that doesn't sound like a lot, but in 1790, that was an enormous amount of money. $54 million is owed by the national government. Then each of the 13 states had debts of their own. And those debts were to wealthy aristocrats and merchants within the state who had provided resources to the war effort. So those states owe money. Hamilton, pretty clever here, he's going to go to those to the states and say, don't worry about your debt. You're part of the United States now, and we have a stronger federal government. So we're going to take over the money that you owe. Isn't that nice of us, states? And the states are a little shocked by what's going on. But in Hamilton's mind, if you owe 54 million, what's another 25 to the debt that you owe? And it relieves the state of that debt and makes the state now more loyal to the federal government. Also, who do the states owe money to? The wealthy, the aristocrats, the merchants in their states. So now if the federal government of the United States fails, which most people in Europe thought that it would, that there's no way that this was going to work long term. If the United States fails, then they never get their money back. So who has suddenly become the biggest cheerleader for the success of the United States? The wealthy aristocratic class. So that was really clever on Hamilton's part. He's also got to generate some cash, because when you assume the debt, and the assumption of the debt, when we use that phrase, that means to acquire the debt. That's when he took the 13 separate debts and made one big gigantic debt. To raise revenue, to make payments on that, he's going to put in place an excise tax, which is a tax on luxury items. And he's also going to implement a protective tariff, which is a tax on imported goods. So it makes it more expensive to buy foreign products and promotes more manufacturing in the United States. And at the same time is generating cash that all comes into this federal pot of money that will then be redistributed in the forms of loans or payments on the debts. So here we've got how the tariff is going to work. So if we start some manufacturing in the United States and we're beginning to make some cloth, and it costs us $4 a roll to make it, British cloth that's been being imported into the United States is also $4 a roll. But with this new tariff, which is adding a 25% premium to buy a foreign made cloth, it's going to cost you $5 instead of $4, depending on which cloth you buy. So cloth is cloth. Of course, people are going to buy the cheaper one. There were some goods that were not being manufactured yet in the United States, and so they were also subject to the tariff, which means that all of this extra money goes into the federal treasury. So not everybody's happy with his methods of generating cash. One of the luxury items, the excise tax, one of the items that it will target for taxation is whiskey, alcohol that's made from the grains and everything. And there were some farmers in Western Pennsylvania who were very upset about this, because they had been taking their grain, whether it's corn or wheat or rye, and they've been distilling it into whiskey, because they could make a higher profit than selling the grain itself and having to transport it across the mountains from Western Pennsylvania to Philadelphia or New York or somewhere to sell. And by adding this tax on the whiskey, then it destroys their ability to make an extra profit. So these farmers were pretty upset, and they said, we're just not going to enforce that tax. So these are people openly challenging whether or not to implement a new federal law. And George Washington is faced with a dilemma here, because once again, you have people within the United States who are acting in rebellion, but how does the federal government react to that? We saw a similar situation with Shays' Rebellion prior to the new Constitution being written, and those people in Massachusetts, who were the farmers who were losing their land, took control of the courts and occupied it, and the federal government was powerless to put down that rebellion and had to leave it to the states. So this is the first real test that the federal government has of its power, and George Washington is going to have a decision to make, and he's got people in his cabinet giving him recommendations in both ways. Part of his cabinet is saying, no, you can't use force against the American people. How will that look? It's going to look almost just like the Boston Massacre. And then you have others in the cabinet, like Alexander Hamilton, saying that you have to demonstrate the power and the force of the United States government. Otherwise, its provisions and its policies are going to be ignored by all of the states. So Washington ends up taking Hamilton's advice. He issues a warning first, and then when it doesn't put down the rebellion, then Hamilton and George Washington literally put together a militia and go out to Western Pennsylvania themselves to stop this rebellion. But when they get there, the whole group has dispersed. The rebellion has quieted down, partially because they recognize that Washington is serious. So look at this cartoon. We always want to pay attention to political cartoons and look at how the symbolism is being used. So the title here, Bottling Up the Whiskey Rebellion. I always want you to take cartoons and, kind of divide it into 4 quadrants and look at the symbolism of what's going on in each one. So clearly this is George Washington with his military uniform on, even though he's still president. He's got the Pennsylvania whiskey here in 1794, the year of the rebellion, and the no whiskey tax that they're ignoring. And he is bottling them up. He is stopping that rebellion from getting out. But also notice that he's got the Constitution in his arm. If he allows this rebellion to continue, then the Constitution is going to lose any sort of authority. So this is an effort, this whiskey rebellion response is an effort to protect the powers of the Constitution. One of the more controversial provisions of Hamilton's plan was the Bank of the United States. So the Whiskey Rebellion, yes, it was controversial, but it was controversial in that one area. The Bank of the United States has everybody kind of buzzing about whether or not this is an appropriate idea and function of the national government. So when you talk about the first Bank of the United States, it's often abbreviated as the BUS, Bank of the United States. And since we're calling it the first Bank of the United States, that indicates that, yes, there's going to be a second Bank of the United States. So the money is going to be coming in to the bank from the revenue that's coming in from the taxation and from the money that's being paid in bonds and all of that. But they're also going to loan money out to investors to make new businesses throughout the United States. And Thomas Jefferson is really worried about this because he feels like this is going to add to the federal government's power and take away the power of the states. One of the other responsibilities that the Bank of the United States would engage in is paying for improvements within the states, whether it's like roads or infrastructure, trying to promote more manufacturing. That would all be done by this Bank of the United States. And Jefferson views that as favoring the northern states. The South has previously had most of the political and economic power, with the focus being on agriculture and plantation cash crops in the southern states. But with this new system that Hamilton is promoting, it's going to shift some of that power away from the South and into the North. Not all of it, but some of it. And so Jefferson's really not on board. And this financial plan is again, very far reaching. So he's going to fund the national debt, not really pay it down to zero. That's not his objective. Assumption of the state debt, where he takes the 13 smaller state debts, adds it to the larger federal debt into one big giant debt. Then he generates cash through the tariff and the tax, sells the bonds like we've talked about, and then also has the national bank. So Hamilton obviously sees this as beneficial in many ways, because we're going to promote new businesses. We're going to establish credit. So if we need to borrow money again in the future, we can do so. And he's going to have the wealthiest Americans on board. Not everybody agrees. In particular, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Now, think back to during the ratification debate. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton worked together to write those Federalist Papers. This is where Madison changes sides. Madison is no longer going to be a supporter of Alexander Hamilton. He and James and Thomas Jefferson team up. But they're both from Virginia, actually in the same area of Virginia. They're neighbors living down the road from one another. And Hamilton recognizes that if he doesn't have Hamilton or Jefferson and Madison on board with his proposal, it will never pass through the Congress. And here's why. Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, does not have the power to implement a tax. The only area of government that has that authority is the legislature. They're the only ones who can create a bank. They're the only ones who can pass a tariff. They're the only ones who can create a tax. So if Hamilton wants to get his program implemented, it has to pass through the legislature now, which was the largest state at the time that would have had more representation than any other state in the legislature. That would be Virginia. So all of these proposals are actually going to hurt Virginia in some way. And so Jefferson and Madison, who are from Virginia, that's their point of view. Remember, we're always thinking about sourcing, right? So their point of view would be that of a Virginian who's reluctant to lose their state's power. So Hamilton knows that this is going to be blocked by Jefferson and Madison, who are really the leaders from their state. Even though Jefferson's not in the legislature, he's got a lot of prominence, and people in the state are going to pay attention to him. So they organize a dinner party to work out all of their differences. And this dinner party is going to be attended by Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton. And at the dinner party, you can just imagine they've got a little bit of small talk going on. But then this is when Hamilton really lays it down. Hamilton says, I really need your support on my financial programs, getting them passed through the Congress. And Jefferson and Madison kind of bristle at the idea. And Hamilton then goes further and he said, we've got to determine a permanent location for this new capital of the United States. And, maybe we could consider kind of putting it down in your area near Virginia, maybe right on the banks of the Potomac River. And Hamilton has made this suggestion, and Jefferson and Madison buy into it. And they don't really know if that's going to give Virginia any sort of advantage, but they view it as something that couldn't hurt. So they agree to support Hamilton's financial plan to get it through the Congress, even though they disagree, especially with the Bank of the United States as being a power that they have as a legislature, and we'll see why in just a second. But in return for supporting that, Hamilton will support creating the new federal capital on the banks of the Potomac River, which is right there in between Virginia and Maryland. They're going to carve it out, and that would satisfy these Virginia leaders. All right, so that's the dinner party and the negotiations that go on there. So that's why Washington, D.C. is located where it is today, because of a dinner party and a deal that was made there. Now, here's why Jefferson and Madison don't think that the provisions of creating a Bank of the United States are fair. If you go back to when you did your Constitution packet, right? Okay. One of the questions at the top of the second page, it had you to write some of the powers exclusively held by the Congress. What are the things specifically listed? So this was in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It lists specifically the Congress of the United States has the power to, right, create post offices, tax, create a military when necessary. It's very specific. Coin money, right? It has a very specific list of things that Congress has the power to make laws concerning. Jefferson says nothing in that list of powers says that the Congress has the power to create a bank of the United States. That's not listed. So Jefferson says, therefore, the Congress does not have the power. So he is viewing the Constitution through what we call strict construction. Strict construction means only what is specifically listed in the Constitution is a power of the Congress. If it's not spelled out there specifically, you don't have that power. So that's the perspective that Jefferson and Madison are coming from. So that's going to become kind of part of the anti-federalist faction that we're going to be discussing here in a few minutes when political parties form. Hamilton is going to view the Constitution and the powers a little bit differently. He's going to view it through what's called loose construction of the Constitution. He says that when you look at this list of 18 items in Article 1, Section 8, you look at that list of 18 items, look at number 18. Hamilton is going to base all of this on number 18. Number 18, when it says Congress has the power to, and it lists 1 through 17, number 18 says, enact laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying out the business of the United States, or the obligations of the United States. Necessary and proper. It has the power to make laws that shall be necessary and proper for conducting the business of the United States. Well, what does necessary mean? My definition of what's necessary could be totally different than your definition of what's necessary. This is where Hamilton says that he has the authority to create a Bank of the United States. He says, look at the financial crisis that we're currently in. It is necessary for the United States to have a bank, a national bank, in order to get this financial crisis under control. Otherwise, the nation is in danger. So it is necessary for us to do this. So this loose construction of the Constitution is always going to really rely on that last little phrase, necessary and proper. We call it the necessary and proper clause that opens up the powers of the government beyond what is specifically listed. Now, why would they have written it in there that way? They knew that that had to be vague. But when the Articles of Confederation were written and they were very limited and they were flawed, and it was difficult to try to come up with some resolution to revise it, the framers of the Constitution, they wanted this document to last a long time. And they knew that way in the future, there may be situations that they've never even thought of. Think about currently, we have laws related to cybersecurity that could not have even been dreamed up by anybody in 1789. The idea of an internet or social media or cybersecurity, nothing like that could have come up as something that they should have listed in that Constitution. But because you have that last phrase, that Congress has the power to make laws that are necessary and proper for the United States, it allows the Constitution to expand and grow with the times without having to be thrown away and start over again like they had to do with the Articles of Confederation. So that same clause, the necessary and proper clause, is sometimes referred to as the elastic clause because it allows the Constitution to expand and contract when necessary. And it's also referred to as allowing implied powers. Rather than specific powers in the first 17, the implied powers are those not specifically listed. So this is all about how you interpret the Constitution. The Federalist and Hamilton will believe in loose construction of the Constitution, that there are more powers than those specifically listed, where Jefferson and Madison are going to believe in strict construction of the Constitution, only what's specifically listed. And I emphasize this because this is an argument that even comes into modern times. When there are hearings to review the qualifications of judges before they get appointed to a position, one of the questions is always, how does that judge interpret the Constitution? Are they a loose constructionist or a strict constructionist? These are still terms that are used today about how you view the Constitution, loose versus strict. So it's very important that you keep that straight moving forward. So that puts Hamilton and Jefferson at odds with one another. And they're both just yelling in George Washington's ear about, what to do with this. And Washington sides with Hamilton on the bank and on the issues of the financial system. And Jefferson's a little upset by that. There's another area where Jefferson and Hamilton greatly disagree, and that's what to do with the French Revolution. Whose side should the United States take? And the basis for the early part of the French Revolution is very similar and reminiscent to the revolutionary causes in the United States. So many Americans were sympathetic to the cause. Thomas Jefferson believes that we owe it to the French to support the Treaty of Alliance that they had entered into during the American Revolution to support us. Jefferson, who has lived in France and has very close connections there, believes that this is an obligation of the United States. Hamilton disagrees, because if we side with the French, because as you know, in the French Revolution, after the first couple of years, that revolution expands into a war against all of the monarchies of Europe. And France, once again, was at war with Great Britain. And Hamilton's trying to get this new financial system off the ground. He's trying to trade new manufactured goods from the United States to other countries. And Great Britain was the main trading partner. So if we go to war and we side with the French against the British, that's going to hurt any sort of economic trade success that the US would have. So again, Hamilton and Jefferson are both just really, really going after George Washington on their perspectives on how to handle the French Revolution. So George Washington has a decision to make. Is he going to side with his Secretary of State, whose job is to advise him on foreign affairs and to openly and formally support the French in the Revolution, providing military assistance in their war in Europe? Or is he going to side with Alexander Hamilton, who's saying we need to protect our relationship with the British and support the British in their war against France? So Washington actually doesn't listen to either one of them. Washington actually issues what's called a proclamation of neutrality. And it's going to side in favor probably Hamilton a little bit more, because it doesn't really openly support the British, but it doesn't openly oppose them. So this proclamation of neutrality that Washington issues in 1793 says that the United States is not going to get involved in the war on either side, but we're going to trade with everybody. And that's going to be the main foreign policy foundation that the United States will follow from this very early point in 1793 all the way through World War II until we get to the Cold War. The US is going to stay out of foreign affairs politically unless provoked. All right, that's the caveat there, unless provoked. And we're going to expect to trade with everybody. So a belligerent nation is a country at war. So we're saying here in the Proclamation of Neutrality, we're going to trade with everybody, even though you're at war. We're going to trade with the French. We're going to trade with the British. Well, Jefferson is furious, right? He views himself as Secretary of State. He should have had his voice listened to more so than anyone else. And when he's been ignored and he's lost this battle over the bank, he's going to quit. He quits the job of Secretary of State, goes back home to Virginia. He believes he can do his state more good than he's doing here in the federal government. So there's a lot of turmoil that's going on these various issues. But out of this, so here's this proclamation of neutrality, and he does seek his advice of his cabinet. So this is George Washington's notes on the matter related to the question of neutrality. So he has these questions that he's asking. What are we going to do about the citizen Genet, who has come from France? He is this foreign minister who's actually roaming around the United States on his own, trying to drum up support, and they're going to end up stopping him, which also makes Thomas Jefferson angry. And he's also asking about just how obligated are we to uphold that original treaty from 1778? Well, in Hamilton's mind, he's saying, but that treaty was negotiated under the government of the Articles of Confederation, which that government doesn't exist anymore. We have a new government under the Constitution. So Hamilton says we're not really obligated to uphold that. Jefferson had said, no, we're absolutely bound to uphold that. So that's going to be another sticking point. So when Washington makes his decision, it's going to be kind of middle of the road, where we're not going to stop our trading with the French, but we're also not going to provide military assistance. From Washington's point of view, Washington looks at the new United States, that if we get into a war and we side with either Great Britain or France, if we happen to side with the losing side, what happens to our nation? Do we get to keep our independence, or would we suddenly become part of Great Britain again, or would France take control of the United States? So this was one of the reasons why George Washington stayed out. He said the US is too unstable, too weak right now to engage in a war on another continent. Think about the expense that the British have incurred in the French and Indian War, and then also in the American Revolution. That's what the United States was headed for if they fought in this war. So Washington believes the best course of action is to stay neutral, focus on production and economic gain here in the United States. Well, this gets messy because Great Britain and France are at war with one another, and our ships are sending goods across the Atlantic to try to sell. And the British ships begin the process of what's called impressment of sailors. The British are going to stop American merchant ships in the Atlantic. They're going to go on board. They're going to seize some of the cargo because they said that that was contraband that could have been on its way to France to help in their war effort. So they believed that they were justified in seizing that cargo. But they also began to kidnap American sailors. So, and force them into service in the British Navy. And what they claim is that these are actually British citizens who are obligated to serve in the British Navy, and they're avoiding their responsibility. Well, a lot of these men are saying, but I'm an American citizen. How would you have proven that at the time? There's no such thing as a passport. There was no way to prove your citizenship at the time. And so many of these sailors were, against their will, forced into service in the British Navy. Well, this was outrageous. This was complete disrespect for American independence and the idea of American citizenship. And something needed to be done, but not go to war. Because again, Hamilton's telling George Washington, you know, you've got to defend the honor of the United States. It's time to go to war, because that's just kind of Hamilton's personality, which is always very aggressive. But Washington is wise enough to know that this is not the right time to go to war. So rather than fight over it, he's going to send a negotiator over to England to try to negotiate and work out this issue. Remember, Thomas Jefferson has quit, so you don't have the Secretary of State. So instead, he's going to send John Jay, who is the first Supreme Court Chief Justice. And a lot of people think that he's going to be the new generation of rising stars politically. You'll remember that he had helped to negotiate the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution. And he was also part of, he had helped with writing the Federalist Papers. He only wrote a couple of them, but he was still kind of in with that group. So George Washington sends him over to Great Britain to try to work out a deal. Now, when he's there to work out this deal, he doesn't have the luxury of being able to call back to George Washington and say, here's what they're offering. What do you think I should do? He's got to make the deal, make the treaty, and then when he comes back, the United States reviews it. So he's gone for a number of months, and he comes back with a treaty that he's worked out with the British, and everyone's really excited to read it. So here's the treaty, and they're going to sit down, they're going to read it. And, you know, they get to the first part, and it says the withdrawal of the British troops from their post in the American West. Remember how the British had never left after the American Revolution? They still occupied all those fortifications out there. So John Jay has gotten this pledge that the British soldiers will finally, once and for all, leave the American West. It is 1795. The war had ended in 1781. The treaty was negotiated in 1783. So it's been over a decade and they're still there. Great job, John Jay. Good job getting the British soldiers out of the West. Well done. All right, let's see what else you did. So they keep reading, and it says that there's going to be a commission put together to determine the boundary between the United States and Canada. Wait, what? So what is the boundary, John Jay, between the United States and Canada? Did you work that out? Well, no, we're going to set up a commission to determine what the boundary is going to be. Okay, so you really didn't resolve it. No, but we're going to have a commission. Okay, but good job getting the soldiers out of the West, but this part I'm not so sure about. Okay, and then you read a little further, and it says that there will be a commission established to resolve the British ship seizures of cargo and the impressment of sailors, and to protect the loyalists from losing their property from the American Revolution. No, wait a minute. Read that again to me, John Jay. Yeah, we're going to set up a commission to determine how to resolve issues of British ship seizures. So you're talking about the cargo and the soldiers that they're taking from the United States? Yeah. But John Jay, you were supposed to sort that out. You're telling us that there's going to be a commission put together to resolve this. So did you resolve the issue or not? Well, not exactly, but we're going to have a commission sort this out. Oh, John Jay, that's terrible. That was your main job, was to deal with this issue. And what loyalist losses from the American Revolution? What are you talking about? Well, there's some loyalists who claim that they didn't get their property back. That's going to have to be worked out. Okay. And also the final provision here, those pre-Revolutionary War debts that Americans owed to British merchants, that all's got to be paid back. Okay, so pre-war debts, that goes back to the pre-Revolutionary era. Are you talking about like the Boston Tea Party? Are you talking about taxes that weren't paid? all that, wait, we fought a war and won over that issue, and now you're saying that we've got to go back and repay all of that? Oh, John Jay, this is terrible. But good job getting the soldiers out of the West. So this treaty destroys John Jay's political career. People were outraged over the lack of success of this treaty, other than getting the soldiers out of the West. Everything else, not great. John Jay, at one point later in life, he kind of joked in one way, and he was writing about it, and he said that he could walk from Georgia to Maine simply by the light of his burning effigy. An effigy is like where you've got a symbolic representation of somebody. So he's saying that so many people were upset with him, and they were burning these symbolic replicas of him because they were angry over the treaty. He didn't need a lantern or a light. He could just walk from Georgia to Maine because so many people were upset. So this was a bad, bad treaty, but it kept the United States out of the war. So the two good things that come out of this terrible treaty, one, the British soldiers come out of the West, and number two, are we going to war with Great Britain? No, we're not going to war. So it maintains the peace. So that's why George Washington reluctantly will agree to the treaty, because it does keep us out of the war and it does get the British soldiers out of the West. Everything else, not great. At the same time that John Jay was in Great Britain, George Washington had also sent another negotiator to Spain, Thomas Pinckney, because the Spanish had blocked American access to the port at New Orleans and use of the Mississippi River. And that was hurting Americans' ability to trade their goods down the river and to use the port. And so George Washington had sent Thomas Pinckney from South Carolina to negotiate with the Spanish at the same time that John Jay is going to Great Britain. Well, Thomas Pinckney, he comes back with his treaty in 1795, same year, and it is an amazing treaty. He gets not only access to the river and the port, but he gets free access to the river in New York. We don't even have to pay rent to use any of our ships, can come in, not having to pay any sort of extra fees. So the Pinckney Treaty was amazing. Well done, Thomas Pinckney. John Jay, not so great of a treaty, except for getting British out of the West and keeping us out of the war. Everything else was terrible. Why would the Spanish so readily agree to these terms? Well, it somewhat goes back to the Jay Treaty, because no one else in the world thought that John Jay would have negotiated so bad of a treaty. So they were worried that maybe there was some sort of secret behind the scenes alliance between Great Britain and the United States. And Spain was a country on decline. Remember, their peak of success was during that period in the early exploration with the conquistadors in Spain and the gold coming out of the Aztec nation and all of that. Well, that money is dwindling away. And Spain is a country that has really, really begun to lose a lot of power. And Spain was worried, what if the United States and Great Britain are secretly starting to work together and they're plotting to take over all of North America? Spain would much prefer to negotiate with the United States and give them access to this river and this one port than to lose all of their possessions in North America. So that's part of why we think that Thomas Pinckney was so successful, is again, they thought that there was some underlying agreement, which didn't exist, between the United States and Great Britain, because they couldn't imagine that there would be a treaty that bad that would have been negotiated. The French also think that there has to be more to that agreement between John Jay and the English. And so the French began to start attacking American ships as well, because they think that the Americans are secretly smuggling things to the British, again, that there was something underlying in the Jay Treaty. So things are just really going poorly here. This is also land and territory that Pinckney gets out of the treaty. So in addition to just use of the Mississippi River and the port at New Orleans, this disputed land, it now becomes free and clear territory of the United States. So Florida is still part of the Spanish possession. New Orleans is still part of the Spanish possession, but all of this territory that we see in Alabama, what becomes Alabama and Mississippi, is now free and clear to the United States with Pinckney's treaty. All right, France is in trouble because the war is getting much more radical in Europe. They've expanded, they're fighting other European powers as well. And they're also losing control of their colonies. And one of their prime sugar producing colonies was Saint-Domingue, which is what we would call today Haiti over here. And look at the demographics of Saint-Domingue during the time period. You've got about 500,000 slaves that make up 89% of the population of the island. Only 6% of the population are free whites. So this demographic and the frustration that the enslaved people had given their situation leads to a slave rebellion. And it's led by this man, Toussaint Louverture. And this is the only slave rebellion, large-scale slave rebellion that works and is successful during the period. Okay, so the Haitian Revolution, they break away from French control. The enslaved persons get their freedom, and they create a new nation called Haiti. So this is not working out for Napoleon. Napoleon has now risen to power. We've got the Napoleonic Wars that have been expanding across Europe, and Napoleon has now lost control of this colony through a slave rebellion. So I would really emphasize that this is a successful slave rebellion, which was rare. Most of those slave rebellions failed. But the impact that this has on the United States is that many people during the Haitian Revolution are going to flee, whether they were enslaved persons, whether they were former slaveholders, whether they were free persons living on the island. Many of them come to the United States and they begin to bring stories of this successful slave rebellion. And many white Southerners were worried that this was going to plant the seed of rebellion potentially in the United States as well. So once again, we see this ramping up of policies in Southern states that will control slave populations in a more aggressive manner. So that's the Haitian Revolution. So out of all of these issues, whether it's the issues over whether or not to support the Bank of the United States, whether it's the issue of whether or not to support France or Great Britain in the French Revolution, whether it's the issues of whether or not to support the Haitian Revolution, which side to support, all of those issues together will create political parties, okay? So this is the first party system, and I would take some time and I would create this chart. I would pause the video and I would create this chart. It's got two different slides. So this is the first part of the chart for the first political system. And then the second slide is going to be the next political system. So here you've got the two political parties, the Federalist Party, and then all of these names are the same party, the Anti-Federalists, the Jeffersonians, Democratic Republicans, or just the Republicans will be names used for the same group of people. Now, these two parties are not the same as the factions that we saw during the ratification debate. A faction, now here's the difference. A faction is a group of people aligning on one particular issue. So over ratification of the Constitution, you had a Federalist group and you had an Anti-Federalist group on that one issue. A political party is going to be a group of people who have similar ideas on a lot of issues. So a faction is more narrow on the issue. A party is broad over lots of issues. So out of those original factions, we end up seeing as more issues and events become important in the new nation, it solidifies into these political parties. And here are the leaders. All right, now we'd see most often during the period, the official name would have been Democratic Republicans, and these are not going to be the Democratic or the Republican Party of today. This is not the same party. We often see modern historians refer to them as Jeffersonians because it distinguishes this group of people from the later parties with similar names, okay? Because this is the party of Thomas Jefferson, the followers of Thomas Jefferson's ideals. And then the Federalists are going to be led by Hamilton and John Adams. Jefferson and Madison will be on this side. We can look at a general statement of who tended to support which party. Upper class people primarily, would be supporters of the Federalists, and they typically came from New England. Now, that is not to say that there weren't Federalists in the South. There were, and there were also commoners, lower class people who were Federalist supporters. But we're saying in general, these would be characteristics that would relate to supporters of those parties. Then we have on the Democratic Republican side, we've got common people, lower class individuals who tended to come from the South and the West. So that's the alignment. On the issues that they are related to, same two parties, looking at the idea of who should actually serve in the government, the Federalists were afraid to give too many people the right to vote because they were afraid of uneducated decisions being made, right? If you've got people who aren't able to read or write, how are they familiar with the issues to know which person to support? So they believe that really the government should only be made up of these upper class people who had an education, who were able to make those good decisions. Democratic Republicans, just as their name would suggest, feel the opposite. They feel that more people should have access to participation in the government, that it's a government of the people. Think about what Thomas Jefferson wrote and James Madison wrote in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. It was about we the people, and then the people in the social contract of the Declaration of Independence. In terms of interpretation, Federalists, like Hamilton, are going to believe in loose construction of the Constitution. Democratic Republicans under Jefferson and Madison believe in strict. And then Hamilton's program, obviously the Federalists support it. Democratic Republicans oppose it, and then foreign affairs. So these are all of the issues that make up this first party system. Now we're going to be getting into changes in the political parties later in the course when we get into the second party system and then eventually the modern parties that will emerge. So George Washington, he served his 2 terms and he's going to voluntarily step down. He probably could have easily been elected to a 3rd term as president of the United States, but he wants to show that he's not a king and he's just tired. The man has been in public service for close to 40 years. He wants to live out the remainder of his life on his farm at Mount Vernon. So as he's leaving, he gives this speech that's called his farewell address. And he explains why he's not going to run again to show that he's not a king, even though he could have won. But he also issues some warnings and some recommendations. He's really trying to convince the people, don't go down this road of political parties. He thought it was a terrible mistake because if people become so aligned with their party, then they're not really making decisions that are in the best interest of the entire nation. So that's going to be dangerous. And he also is really, really reluctant to allow the United States to get involved in the foreign affairs of other countries. So he's also issuing that statement, that suggestion to stay away from entangling alliances. So with that neutrality proclamation and then the warning in the farewell address, this does establish that precedent or that example of staying out of foreign affairs. That's going to be our foreign policy for many, many decades to come. You know, this idea only get involved with trade with other countries, not politically. So we've got an election now, and the way the Constitution was written at the time, the Electoral College, the person who gets the most votes in the Electoral College is president, and the person who gets the second most votes in the Electoral College is vice president, and every elector gets 2 votes. Okay, so look what happens. We've got the 2 political parties, and we're going to see that John Adams gets 71 votes, and Thomas Jefferson gets 68. And notice where they come from. You've got this Federalist stronghold here in the North because they're the ones benefiting from Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. That was something that Jefferson complained about. The power previously, the financial and the political power had previously been centered in Virginia and in the Chesapeake region and in the South. But now you're shifting some of that power to the North with new industrialization. So Jefferson is going to carry the deep South, and then these middle states and the southern states here are going to split their votes. But in the end, you've got Adams with more votes than Jefferson. So Adams becomes the president and Jefferson becomes the vice president. What's wrong with that? Well, they're from two different political parties. Can you imagine if we had in the election in 2016? Can you imagine if Donald Trump was president and Hillary Clinton became the vice president? How well is that going to work? Probably not very well. So this is also a demonstration that this is a problem. This is a flaw in the way that the elections are going to be conducted. So this was in that election of 1796. Later on in 1804, the 12th Amendment will be added that says that that the candidates will run as a pair, right? A president and a vice president together. And so that they change it so that this issue can't come up again. All right, so John Adams is now the new president of the United States. He's a strong Federalist, and he's got a pretty good background politically. He's been very, very well respected during the Revolutionary War, working to help negotiate the treaty, working to help negotiate the alliance. He's also been very successful prior to the revolution in the patriot cause, defending and providing order to the colonies. And he comes into the presidency well qualified, but his presidency is not going to go very well. He is trying to get the French to back off their interference with American shipping. So he sends some American negotiators over to France. And when they get there, these mysterious three individuals come across the American diplomats and they say, oh, we hear that you want to talk to our king. Well, if you do, you need to pay us this amount of money. And they say, wait a minute, you want us to pay money? Does that guarantee any sort of resolution to our shipping issues where you're interfering with our shipping? Oh, no, that's just going to get you access to the king. Well, they say, why would we pay bribe money? So this is, again, an example of the disrespect that the American government is experiencing by the Europeans. The Europeans felt like they could extort this money out of the United States because the US was weak. How were they going to back it up? So the negotiators for the United States, they say, we're not participating. And it's called the XYZ affair because of these mysterious agents for the French who had been demanding this bribe money were known as X, Y, and Z. So these stories of what had happened come back to the United States and people are outraged. How dare the French disrespect the United States in that way? And that's going to cause more people who had previously been sympathetic to the French situation in the French Revolution to turn against them. So that's one event during John Adams' presidency. The other is you've constantly got these Democratic Republicans who are challenging the ideas of the Federalists. And Adams is frustrated by that and is worried that more people are going to be drawn to that cause, the more trouble the Democratic Republicans are stirring up because they're beginning to issue more publications, more newspapers that are directly tied to the Democratic Republicans. So there are some laws that John Adams gets passed through his Federalist-controlled Congress that are questionable. And I would emphasize these in your notes. The first one is the Naturalization Act, which is going to extend the time that an immigrant had to wait to become a citizen. And if you're not a citizen, you can't vote. Once these immigrants became citizens, which party would they probably align with? Well, they're probably going to align with the Democratic Republicans. So by extending the time period, and I'm talking extending it by years, how long you had to wait to become a citizen, that's going to protect the Federalists from having more voters siding with the Democratic Republicans. The other two laws that they passed that are even more questionable than the Naturalization Act were the Alien and Sedition Acts, which basically do the same thing, but they're targeting two groups of people. Sedition is where you are openly criticizing a government individual or a government policy, and you're doing that through speaking out or you're doing that through publications. Sedition, it's almost like treason or disloyalty in some ways. So the Alien and Sedition Act make it illegal to challenge the government of the United States, an individual political or government leader in the United States, either by speaking out against them or by writing something that is challenging the policies or an elected official. If you were an immigrant and not yet a citizen, the Alien Act is what would be used to stop those types of actions. So it's both of these are doing the same thing. They're stopping people from writing about or openly speaking about the government in a negative way or a critical way. If you're an immigrant, the Alien Act is going to be where the president can deport you as a result of your actions or your speech. So the Alien Act is targeting immigrants. The Sedition Act targets citizens of the United States. So think about what they're doing. A citizen of the United States who writes an editorial article in a newspaper that openly criticizes the Federalist for some issue, they can be put in prison and fined money for that. What's wrong with that? Well, doesn't it sound like it violates the Bill of Rights and that First Amendment protection of free speech and free press? So many people, especially the Democratic Republicans who are targeted by these laws, are crying out, this is exactly why we said that we had to have a protection of individual rights written into the Constitution. It's for this very situation. So the popularity of John Adams really plummets after the Alien and Sedition Acts because they were so controversial and questionable. The action that Thomas Jefferson's going to take, by this point, he's had enough. Remember, he's the vice president when all this is going down, and he quits that job. He comes back home to Virginia, and he's going to, again, feel like he can do more good for his home state. So James Madison and Thomas Jefferson are going to say, in their state, they're going to pass a set of laws within their states called the Virginia Resolution and the Kentucky Resolution. This is in the state legislature that says they will not enforce the Alien or the Sedition Act in their state because they view that law as unconstitutional. Emphasize this. So link together the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions with the Alien and Sedition Acts. This is the Democratic Republican response to a law that they view as unfair and violating the Constitution. So we call this nullification of a law. They're going to make it, you know, in math, like the null set is empty. So you're going to nullify the law. You're going to make it void. You're going to make it empty. And within their state, they're going to make it unconstitutional. Okay. Now, can the state do that? Don't know. Under the Constitution, you wouldn't think so because it's providing the federal government with more power. But Jefferson and Madison say, go back to the social contract. What happens when a government becomes abusive of its power? When it's making policies and laws that are unfair to the people? Isn't it the right of the people then to get rid of that law that's unfair? So they are going to claim for their state the power to nullify or make void a law. They can declare the law unconstitutional according to this belief. Okay, now that's going to come up again here in a minute. So Adams is pretty unpopular, and he's not going to win in the next election. And Jefferson and Madison are going to kind of work together to figure out a way to get a Democratic Republican elected. And they start to plot and plan among these Democratic Republican supporters. And they say, you know, every elector gets 2 votes. So why don't we go ahead and plan out who we want the vice president to be? And Madison and Jefferson are from the same state. Remember, they're both from Virginia, and they know from the previous election, they're going to need to pull some votes from New England. And so they go in the Mid-Atlantic. So they go and they find this guy, Aaron Burr, who's pretty powerful in New York. And that's also the state of Alexander Hamilton. So if they can get Aaron Burr, who's a Democratic Republican, on the same ticket as Thomas Jefferson and tell all of the Democratic Republican electors to the Electoral College to give your first vote to Jefferson and give your second vote to Aaron Burr, then that's going to give them what they need to defeat John Adams, who won't have enough electoral votes because of drawing some out of New York. So they planned this out, but they wanted to make sure there wasn't a tie. So they had planned for one of the electors to only cast 1 vote and then not cast another vote Aaron Burr. That way it's going to come out with Jefferson having one more vote than Aaron Burr. So they had all this planned out. They get to the Electoral College, and whoever was supposed to only cast one vote ended up casting both votes for Jefferson and Burr, and we ended up with a tie. Here's John Adams coming in third. And then they had kind of done the same thing. They had plotted and planned with Thomas Pinckney here in the Electoral College. But then look, bless his heart, John Jay gets one vote. Remember the Jay Treaty that was so bad? So what do we do now? Because we've got a tie in the Electoral College. Well, the Constitution tells us that when there's a tie, the House of Representatives votes to break the tie. So now the House is going to choose between Jefferson and Burr. The Congress is made up of primarily Federalists. So they don't know what to do because they don't want either candidate, but that's who they're choosing from. So they vote over and over and over again, and they still keep coming up with a tie. So eventually, Alexander Hamilton, remember, he's kind of the head of the Federalist Party, and Alexander Hamilton is going to give a direction to the Federalists in the House of Representatives who are making this decision in the election. And he's going to tell them that he would much prefer Thomas Jefferson to be president of the United States than Aaron Burr. Ooh, wait just a second. Wasn't Aaron Burr from New York? Wasn't Alexander Hamilton from New York? Yes, they both know each other and they don't get along. They personalities just clash. They don't like each other at all. And Hamilton does not respect Aaron Burr. He doesn't trust him. And he tells his Federalist friends, I may not agree with Thomas Jefferson's philosophies, but I respect Thomas Jefferson as a patriot and a good man. I do not believe those things about Aaron Burr. So he'd rather have a man of good character, even though he disagrees with his politics, than to have a man who he doesn't agree with his politics and he doesn't trust. So Hamilton swings the election in favor of Thomas Jefferson, and that just really angers Aaron Burr. Now, initially, he had already agreed to becoming the vice president, but when he had a chance of being president, then Burr gets quite angry with Hamilton, who he blames for costing him the presidency. So Burr and Jefferson are going to come in. John Adams is out. Now, let me remind you, when the vote is taken, the popular vote happens in November, Electoral College vote is in December, but the new president doesn't take office until the following spring. At this time, it was going to be like late March, early April, when the new president would come into office. Today, that's been moved back to where the new president comes in January. So we only have a month or two where we've got the president who's been voted out of office still holding office until the new president takes the oath. We call that gap in time a lame duck period. So you're still in office, but you've been voted out and the new president is on the way. But at this time, that was months and months long before they would have been able to have the new president come in, Thomas Jefferson, with his new policies. At the same time that they lost the executive branch, the Federalists also lost control of the House of Representatives and the Senate. So the Federalists are really a party that's starting to decline. They still have Federalists who are there, but they don't have the majority anymore. So during this time, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr are coming in. Jefferson refers to this election as the Revolution of 1800. And he says that the people have spoken, the people have taken charge of this government, where you had an abusive government prior to the American Revolution, and that social contract, the way that they resolved it was by war. What Jefferson says in this time, where we had an abusive government with the Alien and Sedition Acts and some of the policies that were coming down that the Democratic Republicans viewed as unfair, he says that this time, rather than going to war, the revolution was by voting, and that they have taken care of this problem. All right, so look what he has to say. Here's his quote about it. He's reflecting on the election in 1800, and he says the revolution was as real as the revolution in principle of government is that of 76, talking about 1776, was in form, not affected indeed by the sword. So in 1776, that revolution had to be fought by a war. But this time around, it was through rational, peaceable reform, the suffrage, the voting of the people. So he's saying this is just as much of a revolution, a change in authority, because we are shifting. We've got this transfer of power from one party's philosophy to another. And he's saying that is as big of a deal as breaking away from Great Britain. But we did it this time by voting without having to fight a war. Think about, could the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, could they have erupted into a civil war? Sure. But he's saying we didn't do that. We did that peacefully by the people taking control. All right, so this is starting what we call the Virginia dynasty. So the first 5 presidents, 4 of them were from Virginia. George Washington from Virginia near Mount Vernon. Jefferson, then Madison, and Monroe are all neighbors. They all live really close to one another near Charlottesville, Virginia. So it's referred to as that Virginia dynasty. So the power in the presidency is really starting to form around these individuals from Virginia. Here's Thomas Jefferson's house, by the way. So we'll take a little break here for a second and look at some travel photos. His home is Monticello. It's in Charlottesville, Virginia, where the University of Virginia is located, that Jefferson also created. That was one of the things that he was most proud of, was the University of Virginia. And his home sits on top of this mountain. It's gorgeous in this area with the mountains. The day that I went was not this gorgeous. So this is not a photograph, obviously, that I would have taken, but it was one day during the fall. It was quite beautiful. I was there in November one year, and the day that I went to Monticello, it was raining and foggy. Look at this. It was just terrible. You couldn't see hardly at all. So I'm told that the view from the top of the mountain is spectacular. We didn't see it the day that my husband and I were there, but we got to go inside, and it was really an interesting sight, because Thomas Jefferson is just really this interesting man. He's a philosopher. He's an inventor. He's a farmer. He is a lawyer. He's an architect. He speaks 5 or 6 languages fluently. He is one of the most well-read men in America. He has this massive library of books that after he dies, his collection of books ends up becoming the start of the Library of Congress. So he's a pretty amazing man. Here is his grave on the property here at Monticello. And then, of course, they've got a wonderful statue of him. Some of his inventions are in his house, and they're all about efficiency. And this is one, it's called a dumbwaiter. And it was where you would have, it's almost like an elevator for like items going between floors. So here, if this were his dining room where he's hosting these dinner parties, and maybe they're talking about political issues and they don't want people coming in and out, he would push a button on the wall that would signal down into the basement where the enslaved persons, who we'll talk about in just a second, would have been working. That signals that they need another bottle of wine. So you put the bottle of wine here in the dumbwaiter, and then it moves it up through the wall. And then you open the panel here on the side of the fireplace, and there's your new bottle of wine that you would need. And here it is in the home. You can see that. Again, he designs the home. He was fascinated by dome architecture, and he kept adding on to his house and got himself into financial trouble also, by the way, but that's a whole nother story. So his design of his home is very unique. Here is his bedroom and his office, because again, he's all about efficiency, and he would, write exhaustively, and he wanted to make sure that if he had an idea in the night, that he didn't waste time going from his bedroom to his office. So he measured and opened up the wall between the 2 rooms and knew how tall he was. So he made his bed the correct length, and then he could be in his office and his bedroom at the same time. So that again was more efficient for him. He wrote volumes of letters to all kinds of people all over the world, but he wanted to have a record of what he had said to each person, right? If you're working out deals by letter, you want to make sure that you're clear on who said what. So this is really the world's first copy machine. So where he's writing here on this piece of paper, it's making an exact copy on this piece of paper. So again, he's got a copy. So we have incredible records and archives of Thomas Jefferson's work, because we don't just have one side of the story. We have letters that he wrote to people, and we also have letters that they responded to him with because of this particular invention that he had. He was, again, an incredible reader, and he always wanted to have more than one book going at a time. So he had 5 or 6 books, and he would read a page or two here, read a page or two here, and then this rotated around, and then he'd read out of this book and then read out of that book and read out of that book. So it was, again, all about efficiency for him, and he was a brilliant mind. But there were also some contradictions, a lot of contradictions surrounding Thomas Jefferson. And unfortunately, your book doesn't really talk about Sally Hemings, and I think they should. She was an enslaved woman who her mother had been enslaved by the Jefferson family as well. And Sally Hemings' children will be enslaved by the Jefferson family. But she is going to be the mother of 6 of Thomas Jefferson's children. And this is something that the Jefferson family would not acknowledge until recently. Finally, in the year 2000, the Jefferson family and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation acknowledged that indeed Thomas Jefferson fathered the children of Sally Hemings. They finally concluded that by DNA evidence. There had been rumors of this even back during the period when Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings were at Monticello together. But no one really confronted it. It wasn't openly talked about, but there were rumors suggesting that these children were in and around Monticello that looked similar to Thomas Jefferson, and that Sally Hemings was always with Thomas Jefferson. Where this all began, Jefferson's first wife died very young, and they had some children together. And when he was a diplomat sent by the United States government to Paris, Jefferson took his daughters with him. And when he took the daughters with him, Sally Hemings was sent to take care of the children as they were in Paris. Now, she wasn't a whole lot older than the children were on her own, but she was there in the role of caring for the children while she was in Paris. When they come back, when their time in Paris is over and Jefferson and the daughters and Sally Hemings come back, Sally Hemings is pregnant with her first child when they return from Paris. And then when they come back, Sally Hemings will live in the home at Monticello for the rest of her life. So she's not going to be living on in the slave quarters in Monticello with other enslaved persons. The Hemings family is going to actually have a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more freedom than some of the other enslaved people. They don't truly have their freedom until later on. But, this is something that you have to think about. This is the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence. He's the one who talks about all men being created equal, but yet he owned hundreds of slaves, and he had children that we know for sure he had children with Sally Hemings. Now, one of the best books on this situation is written by a fabulous historian. Her name is Annette Gordon Reed, and she wrote a book, The Hemings of Monticello. And if you're interested, it is a great book for you to get and to read. And so she talks about this relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and she uses evidence. She's actually a law professor. And so she uses this legal approach to proving something in the way that she tells this story of the Hemings and the Jefferson relationship. All right, here's the family tree. This is where it gets even more complicated. So Thomas Jefferson's first wife was Martha Jefferson, okay? And so here's Martha Jefferson's parents, Martha Epps and John Wales. John Wales had an enslaved woman named Betty Hemings, who he also had children with. And one child of Betty Hemings and John Wales was Sally Hemings. So Thomas Jefferson's wife, Martha, died when she was young. And when she died, Thomas Jefferson had children with Sally Hemings, who was Martha Jefferson's half-sister, if you're able to follow that dynamic. So this is also discussed and really explored in Annette Gordon Reed's best-selling book the Hemmings at Monticello. So again, I would encourage you to read that if you're interested. So again, we need to think back. What does Thomas Jefferson say about equality? His life is contradicting that. That's not the way that he ultimately lived his life. All right, so let's move into section 2. So there was a lot in that first section. In this second section, we want to look at more of what goes on during Jefferson's presidency. We're going to look at the collapse of the Federalist Party and the new control that the Supreme Court will take. All right, so we've got more people moving into different territories. We can see where people are expanding the population. So we've got Native Americans that are also going to be part of this story. So the Native Americans in and around New York, the Iroquois tribes, are going to be forced into negotiations with the United States to turn over more of their land from upstate New York. That's going to come in the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. So we're kind of going backwards here in time. So again, we're back here in the 1780s. We're going to build up some of these foreign policy issues as we bring things forward. Again, we looked at everything politically, starting with George Washington and then coming through Thomas Jefferson's election here in the first part of chapter 7. Here in the second part, we're going to look more at foreign policy, which would include Native Americans. The Western Confederacy was also a group of native tribes that banded together under the leadership of Little Turtle. This is going to be similar to what we saw with Pontiac's rebellion, trying to draw the French back into the French and Indian War. The same thing happens again after the American Revolution, where the Western Confederacy is going to try to not lose their territory to the United States. They know that once the British are gone, they had tried to limit migration to the West with the Proclamation of 1763, but now that the United States is independent, what's going to happen? So they're worried about this flood of Americans into their territory. So the various tribes begin to work together under Little Turtle, and the Confederation is known as the Western Confederacy. So you've got the Iroquois Confederation in and around New York. Then you've got the Western Confederacy here in and around the Great Lakes. George Washington is concerned about the Western Confederacy, so he sends General Anthony Wayne out to the region with a very large contingent of militia forces in 1795 to put down the Western Confederacy and Little Turtle. And the decisive battle here is the Battle of Fallen Timbers that takes place in 1794. And then Anthony Wayne is going to help to negotiate the Treaty of Greenville. So the Treaty of Greenville is in 1795. This is the same year that we had that terrible Jay Treaty. Good job getting the British out of the West. And also the same year, the Pinckney Treaty with Spain. So this is now going to negotiate with the natives. And the United States views the natives in the Western Confederacy of having been armed by the British soldiers who had been previously out in the West. So this Battle of Fallen Timbers is going to end the control of the natives in this region. And the Treaty of Greenville is going to secure this area in orange, where the natives no longer will claim control of this area, but the area in green is going to be preserved, supposedly, for the natives. So that Treaty of Greenville essentially creates a boundary between what is available for American settlement and what is not. So this is going to make it safe from Indian attack for settlers to move to the West. If they move to the West and they migrate here, they're now going to be able to make money because, again, they've got free access to the Mississippi River due to the Pinckney Treaty. And then also with the Jay Treaty, for all of its flaws, it got the British forces out of the West, again, making it available for American settlement. So if you look at those three treaties of 1795 together, Treaty of Greenville, Pinckney's Treaty, and the Jay Treaty, the three of those together are going to really encourage more migration to the West. You can financially make money because of the treaty with Spain, the Pinckney's Treaty. You can come out there safely because of the Treaty of Greenville, don't have to worry about Indian attacks. And you can also come out there safely with the Jay Treaty because no longer do you have the British out in the West. So all three of those from 1795 encourage more migration into the West. And the population does indeed expand. So look at this. Here's where we stood in 1790. The density of the population was certainly concentrated in and around the coastline. But by 1850, we have massive expansion here into the Northwest Territory, all of this land that had been secured with the Treaty of Greenville. We've got more movement from the in the South to the West and New England to the West. So this is, and we have some more urban areas that are popping up. So these would be cities with a population of 8,000 or more. So we had only a couple of those early on, but look at the concentration of cities and population. So we've got immigrant populations coming in here. We have American settlement populations expanding to the West and the South. The slave population also expands. So we can see the concentration here in and around Virginia in the early period with the production of tobacco. But then when we start to see cotton production pick up, we see more of this expansion into the West, and we see less concentration here in and around Virginia. So let's look at Jefferson's presidency a little more closely, some of the major events there of Jefferson's presidency. You've got the trouble internationally with the Barbary pirates, and these were individuals from Tunisia, the northern coast of Africa, who patrolled the Mediterranean, and when cargo ships would come through, they would stop them with force and demand cash money for safe passage. And the United States had been paying this bribe money for years. Thomas Jefferson says, we're not going to do that. So he uses the American fleet to go and fight a war with the Barbary pirates to demand free access for American shipping. And he does secure that. So this is another one of those contradictions of Thomas Jefferson. We've already seen that with his views on slavery. He had criticized John Adams for spending a lot of federal money to build up the US Navy and the Marines and have this fleet, this permanent military fleet of ships. Adams never used it. Jefferson, even though he criticized Adams for it, actually uses it in a military situation here with the Barbary pirates. Okay. Adams, going back to him, leaving office, the Federalists are in trouble, as we've talked about. They had lost control of the House and the Senate. So the legislative branch was lost. They lost control of the executive branch. Thomas Jefferson is about to come into office. And so during that lame duck period that we mentioned, John Adams is going to appoint a large number of judges to federal positions in federal courts. And what kind of judges do you think he's going to appoint? What type of interpretation will they have of the Constitution? Well, they're probably going to be Federalist-leaning judges who would view the Constitution through loose construction, where it has implied powers using that necessary and proper clause. So we call these the midnight judges. So right at the last minute, when he's, still in office, but he's lost the election, he's appointing judges and judges and judges, more and more of them. And these Federalist judges are going to be there. How long do judges serve, by the way? They serve their whole lives. So John Adams is appointing them. And the way that you appoint a judge is through something called a commission, which is almost like a contract that gives you your job as a judge. And these commissions are signed by the president, but they get delivered to the person who's being offered the position as a judge. They're supposed to be delivered by the Secretary of State. So the Secretary of State under John Adams had been John Marshall. And so he was delivering a lot of these commissions, and one of the judge positions opened up on the Supreme Court during this time period, and John Adams appointed John Marshall to be a new Supreme Court judge. So for a couple of weeks, John Marshall is both the Supreme Court judge and Secretary of State under John Adams. So when the day comes for Thomas Jefferson to take the oath of office, Adams had still been writing out these commissions, and one of them that he had signed was for William Marbury. All right, so here's John Marshall. He had again been part of this effort with the XYZ affair, so that's why he was pretty well known to John Adams. Again, he was Secretary of State, so that's why he was trying to negotiate this with France, and then he becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court January of 1801. The election was in November of 1800, So right here during that cycle of appointing the midnight judges, he's going to be appointed as Supreme Court Chief Justice. He's going to be on the court for over 30 years. And so even though the Federalist Party is going to be long gone, John Marshall is still making rulings in the Supreme Court with a Federalist approach, loose construction of the Constitution. So he's one of the most powerful judges we've ever had. Well, when he gets appointed, again, he's still serving as Secretary of State. And the one of the last commissions that was signed by John Adams was for a guy named William Marbury to become the Justice of the Peace of Washington, D.C., which is really not a very powerful job, but it was a position, a judge position anyway. But time ran out. Adams had signed it the day before he left office. It never got delivered. Thomas Jefferson comes into the White House, which does exist now, by the way. He comes into the White House and he finds this commission, right? Here's the document, the commission that William Marbury was supposed to receive to give him his job. Well, it never got delivered. Thomas Jefferson had appointed James Madison, his buddy, right, from Virginia, to be his Secretary of State. So it would have been up to James Madison to actually deliver the commission to William Marbury. And Jefferson and Madison look at each other and they're like, why would we deliver that? Why would we want yet another Federalist judge? So they don't deliver the commission to William Marbury. Marbury is furious. You know, he deserves this job. It was already signed by the previous president. He should be entitled to this position. Well, he's not going to get the Democratic Republican president and Secretary of State to give him his job. Who might be able to help him? Wow, how about John Marshall, who's now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? So William Marbury sues James Madison. Does that make sense now why it's called Marbury versus Madison? He sues James Madison to get his job. Well, the case is in the Supreme Court, and what he is asking for is a writ of mandamus to be issued to James Madison to force him to deliver the commission. Remember, we talked about what a writ of mandamus was before, that it was something in the Judiciary Act of 1789 that would have empowered the Supreme Court to issue a mandate. A writ of mandamus is a document that is mandating somebody take a certain action. All right. So Jefferson and Madison think this is not going to go well. They are pretty certain that William Marbury is going to be given his job because, again, John Marshall is a Federalist. But John Marshall is so clever in this ruling, and he shocks everybody, and he uses the idea of strict construction to beat James Madison at his own game. And he says, under the Constitution, the authority of the Supreme Court is only dealing with ambassadors from other countries, dealing with laws that are dealing with appeals of cases from the lower federal courts, or cases where one state is a party against another state. Those are the only areas where the Supreme Court can be the first body to hear a case. So the case Marbury versus Madison didn't come up through the federal court system. And he said, according to the Judiciary Act of 1789, that law had given the Supreme Court a power it wasn't authorized to have. So I don't have the power or the authority to issue a writ of mandamus according to the Constitution. So therefore, I'm going to claim that this portion of the Judiciary Act of 1789 is unconstitutional. I don't have the authority to issue the writ of mandamus. Therefore, I will not be giving William Marbury his job. So Jefferson and Madison think, oh, wow, this is great. We kind of won the case because William Marbury didn't get his job. But then they start to think about what Marshall has just done. Wait a minute. He has just claimed for the Supreme Court the power to determine whether or not a law is constitutional, because he said that it doesn't say in the Constitution that the Supreme Court can issue a writ of mandamus. Therefore, this law passed by the Congress in 1789 is unconstitutional and void. It's nullified. Wait a minute. What had Jefferson and Madison previously said about who has the power to determine whether or not a law is fair and constitutional? That had previously been the states. Where had they done this? Where had they used the state to declare a federal law unconstitutional? In the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, right? So the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions had said that the states had the power to nullify an unfair law. They viewed the Alien and Sedition Acts as not meeting the standard of the Constitution and were therefore unfair. And they'd claim that power for the state. So it's limiting the power of the federal government by keeping that very important power for the state to review laws and determine whether or not they're going to be followed. John Marshall has now taken that back from the states and reclaimed it for the Supreme Court. Wow. So John Marshall, in this case, Marbury versus Madison, has claimed the power to interpret the constitutionality of laws for the Supreme Court, taking it away from the states. If Madison and Jefferson had it to do over with, they probably would have just given William Marbury his job, because this is a huge shift in control of power. We still view the Supreme Court today as having this power of what we call judicial review because of the court case Marbury versus Madison. All right, so that's really important to understand. Now, even though Jefferson is a Democratic Republican, he does reverse some Federalist policies, like the whiskey tax that he thought was unfair. He does not extend the Alien and Sedition Acts. He does not increase the size of the military, and he cuts spending. So a lot of those Federalist programs under Hamilton's financial plan are not going to get renewed. However, he keeps the Bank of the United States because he sees that this was successful. So he keeps that Bank of the United States that had been chartered for 20 years, and it will stay there for a period of time. Okay, one of the other contradictions in Jefferson's administration is the purchase of Louisiana. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the president has the power to buy land from another country, but he does it anyway, because during the Napoleonic Wars and this whole controversy between France and Great Britain and Spain, Napoleon had forced Spain to turn over all of this territory that had previously been part of Spain, to turn it over to France. Well, as the war was going along, and France had control of this, once again, we have a problem with being able to access the port at New Orleans. We'd previously been able to do that with Pinckney's treaty, free and clear, but now that Spain is no longer in control, they're not going to honor Pinckney's treaty, so they have blocked American access to the port at New Orleans. So Thomas Jefferson is going to send Robert Livingston over to negotiate the purchase of the port at New Orleans. Let's just buy New Orleans and not have to deal with this ever again. So he authorizes Robert Livingston to go and buy the port. And when Robert Livingston comes back, he says, "You're not going to believe what Napoleon did. Instead of just buying the port, he sold us the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million. I mean, that works out to like pennies per acre. We have doubled the land mass of the United States with this purchase. So Jefferson's got a decision, because he's, according to the Constitution and strict construction, he doesn't have the authority to make this purchase, but he also sees how valuable it would be. So Jefferson does it anyway, and the Louisiana Purchase is passed, and we acquire all of this new territory for the United States. So this is really one of the great successes of Thomas Jefferson's presidency, even though it contradicts his view of strict construction of the Constitution. So now we got to figure out what's out there. And Jefferson sends his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and a military officer, William Clark, out to explore. So they leave from St. Louis and they head out, and they end up at Fort Mandan with the Mandan Indian tribe. And they're going to hook up there with, and they've got a group of people, right? It's not just these two individuals. They have a whole party that is traveling with them. to explore the land. Jefferson wants them to map the land, figure out which native groups are there, figuring out which raw materials could be valuable for trade, and what are the potential economic possibilities here. He wants to know what vegetation is out there, what animal life is out there, and how we could travel across this new territory. So those are all of the things that Lewis and Clark are tasked with doing, and they're gone for like 2 years. Large periods of time where nobody hears from them. Most people assume that they have died, but they are going to, in addition to their expedition, they're going to have a French fur trader, Charbonneau, whose Indian wife, Sacagawea or Sacagaway, depending on where you're from, depends on how you pronounce her name, will travel and be their guides. She can speak the languages of these various tribes, indicating that they come in peace and really help them. She has a baby along the way. I can't imagine her, giving birth and traveling with this newborn infant into the frontier. But they do, and they eventually come back and are heroes. And they write to Thomas Jefferson. They bring samples of all of this different animal life and plant life. They map the area, and instantly people are just fascinated by this expedition that took them all the way to the Pacific coast and back over the course of a couple of years. So Jefferson's vice president, remember, is Aaron Burr, and he and Hamilton aren't getting along. Aaron Burr also sees this opportunity of the Louisiana Purchase as a way for him to get rich quick. And so he and this military commander, James Wilkinson, kind of plot to take over the Louisiana Territory and break it away and make their own country. And it's treason. James Wilkinson, it turns out, is a spy for the Spanish. And then he turns on Aaron Burr and exposes this plot that they had of taking Louisiana for themselves. So this just, again, adds to just the nasty personality of Aaron Burr. Well, he also hears that Alexander Hamilton had been talking about him at a dinner party, talking negatively about it. And he writes Hamilton a letter and he says, "Dear sir, I heard what you said about me and you better take it back." Hamilton gets the letter. He's like, whatever. He just throws it away, ignores it. So that angers Burr even more. So Burr writes another letter. "Sir, I heard what you said about me. You better apologize and take it back. Otherwise, I will challenge you to a duel to defend my honor as a gentleman." Well, Hamilton is not going to back down to a challenge. That's just not in his personality. Even though his son had previously died in a duel not too long before, Aaron Burr takes the challenge and agrees to the duel. And they cross over the river from New York into New Jersey, because dueling had been made illegal by the state of New York, but it was not illegal in New Jersey. So they go into New Jersey, they mark off the paces. And usually when these duels took place between these prominent individuals, you would save your honor by participating in the duel to portray that you're a strong individual. But when they would mark off the paces and they would shoot the guns, they typically would miss, right? They would shoot in the air and they could both say that they had maintained their honor, but nobody actually got hurt. Nobody had actually gotten hurt. So Burr and Hamilton, they mark off the paces. Hamilton shoots and fires into the air, misses, shocker. But Burr shoots directly at Alexander Hamilton and mortally wounds him. He doesn't die immediately. They take him back across the river and he dies, I think, the next day. So this is the Vice President of the United States, Aaron Burr, who has now murdered Alexander Hamilton, one of the most famous men in America. I mean, it was astounding that this would happen. And Burr never gets held accountable for this. He actually ends up leaving and goes out west so that he's not going to be prosecuted for anything. And then later on, he moves back to New York. And nothing ever happens to him for murdering and killing Alexander Hamilton. So when I was in New York a number of years ago, I was walking down the street and I look up from the sidewalk and here is Alexander Hamilton's grave. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's right here. It's right by the 9/11 memorial and the church that's right there that served during the attacks of 9/11. It was a place where the firefighters and the police officers were able to come and rest while they were trying to look for survivors. But anyway, this church, in the backyard of the church is a graveyard, and that's where Alexander Hamilton was buried. And I was like, well, I've got to go see this grave. So I go into the church, and evidently I was not the only person who had this idea. So they allow you to go and walk through the cemetery. And here is his grave. He was only 47 years old when he was killed in the duel. He was really a young man. Think about all of the other things that he could have done later in the next few decades of his life had he not been killed in the duel. And so here it is. It talks about how he was a patriot and a soldier, and he was very, very talented. So here is his grave. Again, everybody was taking pictures of it because this was right when the play was becoming quite popular on Broadway. All right, so the last thing that we want to do in chapter 7 is to finish up with the War of 1812. And we end up fighting yet another war with Great Britain. And this is the War of 1812. So again, throughout the war between France and Great Britain, our ships and our sailors have been continuing to be harassed, and impressment of sailors has not gone away. Jefferson, when he inherits this problem, he tries to deal with it with financial pressure. Think about what the American colonies did when they were frustrated with the British and felt that they were being treated unfairly. They used a boycott to hurt England financially, to force them to act in a way that they would have wanted. Well, Jefferson is going to try the same approach. If we don't want to go to war, he agrees going to war with the British would be a terrible idea right now for the United States. So he wants to hurt the British financially to force them to back down on their interference with our trading and our shipping, and the French as well, because now the French are doing the very same thing. So he institutes what's called an embargo. And it's kind of the reverse of a boycott, where a boycott says you're not going to buy anything from the other country. An embargo says you're not going to sell anything to the other country. So by this point, he believes that France and Great Britain rely so much on American goods that this would hurt them to the point that they would have to back down. So he institutes the embargo, and it is a terrible disaster. So probably one of the biggest failures of Thomas Jefferson's presidency would be the embargo, where one of the biggest successes would have been the Louisiana Purchase. One of the failures is the embargo, because instead of it hurting Europe, those European countries just found other markets to buy their products from. It ended up hurting the United States. These American merchants are the ones who are going to suffer financially, and people are furious over the embargo. So he has to kind of change course a little bit. And so he backs off of the full embargo, and he creates what's called the Non-Intercourse Act. So all three of these provisions are kind of trying to do the same thing, to financially force Great Britain and France to respect our shipping and our neutrality. So he says, whichever, when you guys, Great Britain and France, when you stop harassing our ships, then we'll start trading with you again. So he's trying to say, here's an out to the embargo. If you just agree that our ships are going to be left alone, then we'll open up trade again. Well, of course, Great Britain and France don't budge on that. So then he issues another policy, Macon's Bill number 2, which says, okay, Great Britain and France, you're at war with one another. So whichever one of you agrees that we are neutral, whichever one of you does that first, we're only going to trade with you. Wait a minute. Does that maintain neutrality? If we're saying we're only going to trade with you during a war, are you really neutral? Probably not. So all of these policies are just failures. They don't work. Our ships are still being harassed. Our sailors are still being impressed. This is a political cartoon that you need to be familiar with. It's one that is used often, and I've seen it in a DBQ. I've seen it in multiple choice questions a lot, and I've also seen it in an SAQ. So this is one that is dealing with the embargo. So this is supposed to be Thomas Jefferson with his embargo, right? The license for selling goods is restricting Americans. So here, this superfine, it could be talking about sugar, tobacco, whatever commodity it is, that the Americans are trying to sell to the Europeans. Here's a British ship. It's not able to come into the port because we're not trading with them. But here's some Americans who are trying to smuggle this item to the British. And the embargo is preventing them from doing that as easily. Look what it says up here. Oh, this cursed, oh, grab me. What in the world is he saying? Look at the word, oh, grab me. Look at it. Backwards says embargo. So this is a cartoon that is challenging the embargo. It's saying that this is an inappropriate action, right? Thomas Jefferson is to blame. The snapping turtle indigenous to the United States, again, it's trying to prevent the shipping to hurt the British, but instead it's just hurting the American merchants who are having to rely on smuggling once again to get their goods sold. So again, I would be familiar with this. So it would be from the point of view showing that the embargo was negative, that it was a bad idea. Okay, natives in the West, again, continuing to harass Americans as they are flooding out here. Remember, after the Treaty of Greenville, you've got more Americans migrating to the West, and some of the native groups are not yet finished trying to protect their livelihood, their land. And that's going to be led by Tecumseh. So Tecumseh and his brother, Tenskwatawa, who was a religious leader, a prophet in the tribes, they're going to try to, again, form a group of native tribes to defend their territory and their land. And the Americans have already set up the territorial governments in the region. And one of the governors, the Indiana governor of the Indiana Territory, is going to go after Tecumseh and their kind of network of tribes in and around what's called Prophetstown. They had also tried to go and get more support from other tribes in the different regions. And when they do that, it leaves Prophetstown exposed. And William Henry Harrison is going to come in from the Indiana Territory and come and take control of Prophetstown at the Battle of Tippecanoe. So Tecumseh is again trying to form a confederation of tribes, and you're going to have the American resistance at the Battle of Tippecanoe. So William Henry Harrison is the Indiana governor who's been appointed there. Remember, it's the progression. Once you reach a certain population, you can become a state. Until then, you have a governor who's going to monitor the actions of the area. So William Henry Harrison is in charge of this, and he's successful at the Battle of Tippecanoe, defeats the natives in this region, and he becomes a war hero. You've probably not heard of William Henry Harrison, but he's going to become a president here in the next couple of decades, and he's going to use this success at the Battle of Tippecanoe to bolster his campaign. His campaign slogan is actually Tippecanoe and Tyler too, trying to remind people, remember, I was the guy who won and defeated the Indians and made it safe in the region at the Battle of Tippecanoe. And then when it says Tippecanoe and Tyler too, Tyler is John Tyler, who's going to be his vice presidential running mate. So see, you're going to get me, the successful leader at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and you're also going to get John Tyler if you vote for us. So this is, again, more conflict in the West with the natives. Election of 1808 rolls around. Thomas Jefferson is going to step aside. He's going to follow that two-term tradition of George Washington, not run for a third term. James Madison will run for president for the Democratic Republicans, and he had previously been the Secretary of State. And that becomes the job that's kind of the stepping stone to become the presidency. And that's going to become important here in future elections. Thomas Jefferson had been George Washington's Secretary of State. James Madison had been Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State. The next president after Madison is Monroe. Monroe is Madison's Secretary of State. So this is a job that really does kind of lead to a higher office later on. So look at the breakdown. Madison wins overwhelmingly, but we've got clearly this Democratic Republican stronghold here in the Mid-Atlantic and the South, and only the Federalists are going to continue to support our New England is going to support the Federalist Party in the North, and that's also going to be temporary. So the big issue, again, you know, the embargo, this is what has been hurting these merchants here in New England, this embargo, their ability to trade. And so they were not in favor of the Democratic Republicans. So Madison comes in. And he gets more pressure within his party from these people, the war hawks, to demand that the honor of the United States be upheld. And we go to war against Great Britain. So John C. Calhoun, here he is. Look at those bug eyes. Every year kids are just, they're like, oh my gosh, look at him with that hair and those eyes and the beard, right? This is a beard, not a scarf here. He is from South Carolina, and he is demanding that the United States defend itself against harassment by the British in our shipping. Henry Clay, here he is. He's the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He's from Kentucky, and he is also going to be demanding that something be done. These two individuals are going to represent the new generation of politicians, right? So they're coming, they were not part of the Declaration of Independence or the Revolutionary period. They're going to be the next generation that will come in to leadership. And they're going to put pressure on Madison to declare war. And he eventually does. So by 1812, it's clear that the financial pressure of the embargo and the Makin's Bill number 2 isn't going to work. And for these reasons, the United States goes to war. The impressment of the sailors, the interference with the shipping, and then also what we believe is the British providing the natives, Tecumseh and the others, providing them in the Western Territory with weapons. Because again, you've got this expectation of the British leaving the Western fortifications after the Jay Treaty, but still we believe that they're smuggling those goods in through Canada to the Native Americans. So we're now at war again. Think about what's at stake. We are at war with Great Britain. If the United States loses this war, do we remain an independent nation? So this is pretty much another American Revolution, right? Not so much that we're having to acquire independence, but we're now having to fight a war to keep independence from Great Britain. The war hawks also saw this as an opportunity for us to gain more territory. Let's push the British out of Canada. Let's go and attack Canada and let's claim it for ourselves. So that's going to be the early maneuvers in the war, is that the United States will attack into Canada, and it's a disaster. The US is forced out of Canada. They do, in the meantime, they go into the Canadian capital at York, and they destroy many of the buildings there, but they're not able to hang on. The Canadian and British forces are going to counterattack and force the Americans back across the border out of Canada. So that doesn't work for them. The British are going to try to take control of the new US capital at Washington, D.C. So they come up with the fleet up the Chesapeake Bay. They attack Washington, D.C. in retaliation for the destruction of the Canadian capital. They're going to burn down the US capital that was under construction. They're going to burn down the White House and set many of the public buildings across Washington, D.C. on fire. And it's very, very destructive. And then they leave from Washington, and then they're going to head to Baltimore, which was an important port city right outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland. And this is where there's a standoff. And you've got an American fortification here at Fort McHenry, which is right on the bay outside of Baltimore. And the British are headed in, and they are starting to bomb Fort McHenry. And there is a lawyer, his name is Francis Scott Key, who's there witnessing all of this, and he's on board one of the British ships trying to negotiate the freedom of one of his clients who had been taken prisoner. And while he's there, the fighting and the bombing escalates, and he's stuck. And so Francis Scott Key has to stay on this ship overnight, and he's curious, what's going to happen? Is the fort going to fall to the British? Is it not? And there's this huge flag that flies over Fort McHenry. And he's waiting for the sun to come up the next day to see whether or not the Americans have held on to it or whether it's fallen to the British. And when the sun comes up and he sees the American flag still flying there, it's battered and it's torn up, but it's still flying, he knows that the Americans have held, and he's just overcome with emotion. So he writes this poem, and it becomes the Star-Spangled Banner. So think about the words of the Star-Spangled Banner. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what proudly we hailed at twilight last night? So last night we could see this American flag. Now that the sun has come up this morning, Can we still see it? And then it talks about the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that the stars were still, gave proof through the night, that the flag was still flying. So with all of this firing back and forth, every once in a while, a bomb would explode and it would have this brief flash of light and you could kind of catch a glimpse of it. So the words to the Star Spangled Banner are telling the story of this battle at Fort McHenry in the War of 1812. So again, this is one of the spotlights in the War of 1812, but it really wasn't a truly decisive battle one way or the other. So things are rocking along for a couple of years, and the British are just, they're running out of cash. They've been fighting the French all of this time, and now they're fighting the United States again, and it's just not worth it to them. So here's the burning of Washington, which actually happens prior to the battle at Fort McHenry. And one of the other curious events that happens during this particular battle is everything's been caught on fire. A tornado catches or kicks up in the middle of all of this, and the tornado brings this massive flood of rain that puts out all of the fires and destroys some of the British cannon and some of their weaponry. And it causes them to have to be forced out of Washington, D.C. When have you ever heard of a tornado in Washington? That just really doesn't happen. So many of the Americans at the time said this was just further indication that God was on the side of the United States by protecting Washington, by creating this tornado. So when the British come into the White House to burn it down and destroy it, James Madison had been evacuated. Obviously, he's president of the United States. But his wife, Dolly Madison, stayed behind, and she tried to protect some of the treasures that were in the White House at the time. One in particular was this painting of George Washington. He was obviously the hero of the American Revolution. So she gathers up all of these things right before the British arrive. And so that is a very heroic move by Dolly Madison. So then you've got the War of 1812 again. There are people in New England, these Federalists, who just really think this war is a terrible mistake because you're at war with Great Britain, you're cutting off trade, and they think they have a meeting of Federalists in Hartford, Connecticut, called the Hartford Convention. So this meeting of these Federalists, who are kind of the last few Federalists holding on to their party, and they decide, maybe, or they float the idea, they don't actually accept it, but they float the idea of potentially seceding from the United States and breaking off New England and joining in with Canada. So this cartoon is showing that. So here, these three men are representing Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and they're thinking about breaking away and joining in with the British king, and they just don't know what to do. So this Hartford Convention, right, leap or no leap? Do we leap into British control? Well, when the war ends, and it ends up being a very popular war, when it's all over with and word leaks out that the Federalists had suggested breaking away, that is just so unpatriotic. And this will be the last hurrah for the Federalists. They're not going to exist anymore once this unpopular discussion becomes public knowledge from the Hartford Convention. So this will be the end of the Federalist Party. So the British are tired of fighting, the Americans are tired of fighting, and so they send negotiators to Ghent, which is in Belgium. The Treaty of Ghent will be negotiated there. And they basically go back to the same boundaries that they had before. John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, who's now a Democratic Republican, who is going to be one of the negotiators there. What they end up doing, the provisions here, they go back to the same boundaries. No land changes hands. They don't have any new areas of independence that are granted. So they really just reset everything to where it was prior to the war. So who actually won? Really, there's not a winner and there's not a loser if we're just going to go back to the way things were. So this treaty really just stops the fighting and resets the original arrangement between the British and the Americans. But notice the date, December of 1814. So this was signed the last week of December. Nobody in America knows that the war is over because it's going to take time for the information to travel across the Atlantic, about a month to a month and a half for it to get there. In the meantime, the largest battle of the war is fought, and that's going to be at New Orleans in early January of 1815. So again, nobody knows the war is over, and we're going to fight the biggest battle. The hero of this battle is Andrew Jackson. He had made a name for himself as an Indian fighter. He's fought against the Seminole Indians in North Florida in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and he knows that the British are headed to New Orleans, this port that would give them claim to the Mississippi River again. So he's going to fortify the area at New Orleans, and he is going to absolutely destroy the British in this battle. And it is incredibly decisive. Huge losses for the British, very few losses for the Americans, and Andrew Jackson comes out of this the absolute hero. So Jackson is now going to, word of this battle reaches the East, right? New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Charleston. It's going to take a few weeks for word of that to arrive. So when that arrives in the newspapers in the East, it's going to be the end of January. Well, guess what happens to arrive a week or so after that? News of the Treaty of Ghent being signed and that the war is over. So the illusion is created because of the timing that Jackson's victory at New Orleans has forced the British to surrender when really the war was already over. Now, of course, anybody could look at the dates and see this, but the common perception is that Andrew Jackson is the hero of the United States and has saved the United States from falling to the British once again. So it's a very patriotic time, and it creates this illusion of the Americans being the winners of the war when really nobody won. So how did the Federalists look? Now that this war is over and it's very popular and the image is created of this strong American force, the other European countries are also now going to give the United States a little bit more respect. It looks like maybe they can last after they've won the War of 1812. So the Federalists are really in trouble, other than their success in maintaining the court system. So remember, go all the way back to John Adams and the Midnight Judges. All of these federal judges are going to continue that Federalist philosophy when they are now no longer being elected. We've already talked about Marbury versus Madison in judicial review. The other important court case that you need to pay attention to with this idea of national supremacy, that the federal power will always take precedent over state power, is in McCulloch versus Maryland. And the Bank of the United States is renewed. And when we have the second Bank of the United States coming in, they're going to establish branches of the bank in each one of the states. And John Marshall, the states now have their own banks, but now the new Bank of the United States is brought back and it's in competition. So the state of Maryland thinks they're going to be really clever and they're going to tax the Bank of the United States. Can the state put a tax on a national bank? We know that the national government can tax the states, but can the states tax the nation? No, they can't do that. And so John Marshall, again, reemphasizes the strength of the federal government in the case McCulloch versus Maryland, that when there is a contradiction between a law from a state creating a state bank and a law from the national government, then the national government's law always takes precedence. It is supreme. Okay, so Gibbons versus Ogden is also going to do that. And it's this dispute over who has the right to transport passengers between states. And the state of New York had given a license to a Mr. Ogden. The federal government had given a license to a Mr. Gibbons. And so they contradict. So in Gibbons versus Ogden, the national government's right was protected. So this is supremacy, right? Supremacy of the federal law over the state law. Always, always, always. Federal law takes precedent over state law if they contradict. The third area that he's also going to institute policy of federal supremacy is with contracts. That if there is a contract that is negotiated, it is binding regardless of what happens later on. If you create a new law that challenges the original contract is still binding. And we see that in Fletcher versus Peck. You probably studied the Yazoo land grant situation in 8th grade Georgia history. But this is also upholding that regardless of what happens later, the original contract is binding. And that's also the case with Dartmouth College in New Hampshire that was set up during the colonial period. So even though now we have a new nation and a new government, it is still a binding contract. All right, so there's the contract law. No state shall pass a law impairing the obligation of a previous contract. So the last thing that we want to mention here is James Monroe coming into president. So he had been the Secretary of State under James Madison. He comes in 1816. So again, we see this really strong, popular Democratic Republican vote. We see a few little Federalists still hanging on here in and around Massachusetts. But by the time he's reelected to a second term in 1820, it's all Democratic Republicans. And we're going to call this time period the era of good feelings, because if there's no more Federalist opposition to the Democratic Republican Party, we really only have one political party. So we're politically unified. The economy of the United States is very strong during the late 18 teens. You've got a strong economy. We're not at war with any other country. So things are going really well. So we've gone from this first party system where we've divided the nation between Federalist and Democratic Republicans. Now we've come back together in the era of good feelings as one political party. That's not going to last for long, because some of the Democratic Republicans are going to have ideas that tend to lead more towards stronger national government, and some are going to lean towards a stronger state government. But again, it's almost unanimous here by 1820, all Democratic Republicans. So here's James Monroe's house, again, right down, it's at the bottom of the mountain below Monticello. So they were neighbors, Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe. It's not nearly as fancy of a house, but it's got a beautiful view. Again, I was there on a cloudy day. You can rent it out. You can have a wedding there. You can have a party. Here they've got it set up for an outdoor event. They've got cornhole set up, and then they've got this giant statue of James Monroe. So the big outcome, so two things you need to remember about Monroe's presidency. First is the era of good feelings. Era of good feelings. One political party, Democratic Republicans solidly in control. The other thing that you need to remember is the Monroe Doctrine. So this is the foreign policy of James Monroe that he's going to issue in a speech that he gives before Congress. And it sends a message because there are many new independent countries in Central and South America. They've won their independence from European nations, but again, they're brand new, they're vulnerable. And some of those European countries are thinking, here's our opportunity to get more territory, more resources, more colonies in the Western Hemisphere. But James Monroe takes the Neutrality Proclamation of George Washington and updates it. And he says, we're not going to interfere in the affairs of Europe, only to trade, which is exactly what George Washington said. But our expectation, Europe, is that you're not going to interfere in the Western Hemisphere. So it almost sets up the United States as kind of this leader of the Western Hemisphere to protect these nations. Well, did anybody ask them if they wanted the United States to do that? No. But this Monroe Doctrine just updates and reestablishes the neutrality of the United States. We're going to stay out of European affairs other than to trade unless we are provoked. And this is the basis for US foreign policy all the way through to the Cold War. Once we start the Cold War after World War II, that's when US foreign policy changes. So we're always thinking about how we would write. If you've ever got a question about foreign affairs, anytime between 1820 and 1950, your contextualization, you can always go back and start with the Monroe Doctrine, setting that foundation of neutrality unless provoked. Okay. So John Quincy Adams is going to be Secretary of State under James Monroe. And he also will negotiate with Florida once again to determine these boundaries. And this is where we get Florida. So he negotiates in the Adams-Onis Treaty under James Monroe's presidency. This is when Florida becomes part of the United States once and for all, is with the Adams-Onis Treaty, and John Quincy Adams being the negotiator. He also was at the negotiations at Ghent to end the War of 1812. So he's kind of got this, this foreign policy success that he will use when he comes into the White House. So there we have it. We are finished with chapter 7. That was a lot, but again, it's really important topics. So please make sure that you are familiar with all of these topics, political and foreign affairs. And I will see you next time. So until then, keep reading and go make history.